In this PowerPoint, we're going to be wrapping up section number 2 by looking at public art. Art in public places, street art, and community collaboration. So the question is, what is public art? How is it funded? How does it generate revenue for cities, for communities? So we'll take a look at public art as it's produced in a variety of different ways. And what you're going to see here is some cases where art is produced in front of public buildings, in airports, in public parks, and on the street. It is really created for the purpose of being viewed by everyone. You don't have to pay for public art. In other words, you don't have an admission ticket. You don't have any kind of money that's exchanged. In many cases, public art is mandated by building codes within cities. Different cities have a little different structure for this, but as a general rule, it's about 1% of building costs when a new high-rise or a new public building goes on the block. So public art is recognized by curators and the fine art world. That's something that serves the greater good. It relies on the collaboration of community, oftentimes with volunteers, in some cases, and with volunteers, but certainly with city planners, architects, public officials, engineers. But in some cases, in the case of, let's say, Christo, he always has to get a certain percentage of his collaborators as volunteers. So public art is usually site-specific, which means that it is built to house in a very particular location. In some cases, it will interpret the history of the place. Sometimes it will address social or environmental issues. It can have a range of topics. The work is collaborated with the community, reflecting the ideas and the values by those who create it. So let's take a look at where the history of American public art came from. So during the 1930s, right around the time of the Depression, President Roosevelt created what was called the New Deal. And in the New Deal, its purpose was to install American culture and put artists and artisans back to work. So he created the Federal Arts Project, FAP, to provide work relief for artists by way of painting, sculpture, murals, graphic arts, etc. FAP was just one of many different programs that were instituted at this time under the New Deal. Other programs like the Public Works Art Project, the Department of the Treasury Section on Painting and Sculpture, the Treasury Relief Project, TRAP. These are some of the programs that were really designed to put people back to work, most specifically artists back to work. There was another program called Art and Architecture, which was developed for art programs and still is utilized today. What that means is it goes back to that idea of taking 1% of building costs and allocating them for fine arts. So in the 1960s, public art continued to expand, and it was reinforced by some additional rules and laws that were meant to really create an American culture that could document a period in history and be left as a legacy to a city. So authorization and funding for public art. Public art is usually in collaboration with private investors, local government, and that 1% that we talked about, that 1% of construction costs is allocated. Now that again can vary from location to location. Some cities that are very arts progressive and understand the value both culturally and economically of the arts will typically have a little higher percentage that are allocated for public works. So, for example, in San Francisco being a very progressive, a very cultural centered city, does have art in public places, arts in public areas throughout the city, such as airports, city centers, community areas. These are very, very common. So if you've ever been to the San Francisco airport, for example, one of the things that you'll notice throughout the waiting areas at the airport are paintings on walls, sculpture. They usually have during the major walkways, they'll have cases that are displayed or there for the purpose of displaying art, so that we can use those public spaces as not only places to wait, not only places to be utilitarian, but places that can house a city's cultural identity. So New York City is also an area that puts a tremendous amount of resource and effort into public works projects that are allocated for the public good. Now, street art has a little bit of a different twist. I'm sure many of you are familiar with street art. In fact, most artists or most students that come into this class are probably most familiar with street art. So if we look at some of the history of street art is not necessarily a contemporary idea. You can go back to ancient Greece and Rome, and you will see, particularly at the places like the pyramids of Giza, you'll see graffiti that was carved in during the time of the Roman Empire. So the idea of leaving a mark of some kind is not new. It has taken on, of course, a complete different complexity today in our urban areas, and it is both loved and reviled. And we'll talk about that just a bit in a minute. So street art gained tremendous popularity in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, there was a movement called urban art or guerrilla art. That the purpose of this movement was to create an environment where art spontaneously grew from community, from people on the streets, people in many cases who felt disenfranchised or left out of the greater economy. So it was driven in some cases for socio-political purposes. Typically, artists who work in this venue want their art to be seen by the general public. And again, it's one of those things that is both loved and reviled. Um, those who go out into the street, for example, and let's say tag. Now, tagging may seem like a great thing to do, depending on which side of the fence you're on. However, another way of thinking about tagging or doing spontaneous street art is, how would you feel if somebody came and tagged your car or tagged your house or tagged your property without your permission? It is not something that is always universally accepted or welcomed, but it is part of this sort of guerrilla art movement that stemmed out of the 1980s. But it's not unique to the 1980s. It sort of grew in popularity. So if we look back to, let's say, the 1940s during World War II, there was this Kilroy who spontaneously popped up on the battlefields in World War II, and it became sort of a message that the American troops had been there. So Kilroy was here, and I remember when I was a girl, my father used to talk about Kilroy. Kilroy was here would be in all kinds of unexpected places. So it has a history both in the mainstream, on the battlefield, on the street. It has a sort of a complex history. So most of you today are familiar with Banksy. Banksy is a street artist who came out of sort of the British street movement of the late 20th century. He has strong political content to the work. His art evolved during the British underground movement in the late 80s as well as the 1990s, and it created the satirical art with a stencil style. The reason for the stencil is because this is not a legal thing to do. Street artists would typically come at night. They have to get in and out rather quickly. So if they were to be caught, of course, they could be jailed. So the idea of street art is that you have to move very quickly. So Banksy stencil art became intertwined with slogans that have an anti-establishment content or question the status quo. Banksy, by its very, by his, he, she, it, they, by the very nature of Banksy, is political. The interesting thing about that is that Banksy started in the subways in London. And he and a number of other artists at that time were doing very strong political content in their work. And they became very, very, very popular. And that, of course, then spilled over to New York and to cities throughout both Europe as well as the United States, also in other parts of Central America. So Banksy travels all over, but had his origin in the subways and the British Underground movement. On the street, we see the Rat, King Robo, Julian Beaver. These are all street artists. Now, Bleak the Rat, who passed away a number of years ago, he and Banksy had what were called graffiti wars. And if you're interested in graffiti wars, there's a link to the documentary about this kind of battle between street artists. It is very territorial. It takes ownership of a public space. At least temporarily. And I know that from the viewpoint of the artist, that's part of the thrill, that's part of its intention, is to gain ownership of a public place. Cities have enacted policy regarding street art. Or graffiti, depending on how you look at this, the intention is to get rid of it as quickly as possible so that it doesn't spur on this kind of competition between street artists. So cities will typically come in if they're on top of their program that they've implemented. They try to get to the street art as quickly as they can before others come in and challenge the other street artists. So street art, and let's go back for just a moment because we've got, of course, two very strong political ideas going on here. Julian Beaver, however, was not political in nature. Julian Beaver typically got permission from cities, and street artists aren't always on the realm of spontaneity. Sometimes they apply for permits, sometimes they get permission from cities or from businesses to be able to create their work. Now, Julian Beaver will oftentimes work in street chalk, which means that it's not permanent. It has to be viewed from a very specific angle. That is a technique that was developed during the Renaissance that many street artists today use. So if you stand on one side of this mural, you will see the illusion. If you stand on the other, you can't. So it's based on your location to the artwork. But Julian Beaver has become an artist, a popular artist in his own right, and has been offered commissions by companies, by cities, and so forth to create these temporary public works. Now, murals typically are an art form that is established by an agreement between the artist and the city. Artists will sometimes respond to competitions. Sometimes they have an idea for an area, for a public site, and they'll commission the city to be able to do it. Sometimes the city will sponsor it. Sometimes companies will sponsor it. But murals typically get permission before they're implemented. They will usually go through a panel of jurors that decide whether it is up to a city's artistic standard. And so murals are not something that you can just go in and do. In other words, you can't go to a park and just create a mural. You have to get authorization to do that. Otherwise, what will happen is the city will consider that um, in the same vein that they see tagging, they'll come in and they'll remove it. So in Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles during the 1984 Olympics, these are cities that had a sort of a vision of what mural art should be and allocate funds for it. So they sometimes, like I said, by invitation, sometimes by competition, will assign locations specifically for murals. So they usually, or sometimes, I shouldn't say usually, but sometimes can be gateways for bigger things and a boost for the local economy. So for example, if you go to San Francisco, one of the things that you can do is you can take a mural tour of the city, and those generate funds for the city. It's a walking tour that you can take by tourist companies that will take you to see some of the murals. A mural is usually an artwork painted or applied on a wall, a ceiling, a permanent surface, and it is meant to be a lasting monument, unlike the Julian Beavers who get invited in for a very specific period of time. Murals are usually intended to last a while. So, two very famous muralists would be Shepard Fairey. Some of you will recognize his work. You can see the image of the Hope poster that was sort of the signature of Barack Obama's campaign for president. And below is Keith Haring. Keith Haring started out as a street artist. In fact, he was arrested a number of times in the New York subways for his street art, but Keith Haring became very, very popular in the 1980s. What people don't realize about a lot of his murals is that Keith Haring was part of the underground gay rights movement, and many of the imagery in there addresses the issues of gay identity, gay rights, and so forth. And sadly, Keith Haring lost his life to AIDS. And there is the Keith Haring Foundation that is set up in his honor. And many of the merchandise items that you see here, such as the backpack and so forth, proceeds from the sale of those merchandise items will go into the Keith Haring Foundation, and the Keith Haring Foundation continues to support AIDS research and so forth. So Keith Haring made a name for himself that really has lasted a very long time. You see his style replicated and copied quite frequently, but he, again, started as a street artist, as an artist who did not necessarily get permission early on. For his murals, yes, but in the subway work, not so much. Now, collaborative work is a whole different genre. Collaborative art means that you have a visionary, and the visionary, such as the case of Christo and Jean-Claude, come in with a very specific idea of what they want to bring to a city. Christo and Jean-Claude would work collaboratively together and also with cities. Sometimes their project could take years before they were funded. In fact, if you're interested in, and I'll show you one clip of Floating Piers, that one was done a few years ago. The whole premise of Christo's work was to be able to transform an environment for a very specific period of time. His work was never meant to be up indefinitely. It's really meant to have a beginning, middle, and end. The work is monumental in scale, which means that it takes years in the planning. He usually has to go through a lot of negotiation with the city. In the very beginning, one of his very first projects, as you can see in this lower left corner here, Running Fence was, he originally had some corporate sponsorship to this. Running Fence was produced in 1976 in Sonoma County. And he did have some grant money coming his way for that. And he and his wife, Jean-Claude, who has since passed away, decided that from that point forward, they were going to be self-funded. They did not like the restrictions that were imposed upon them by corporate sponsorship. So, from the point of running Fence forward, they did become self funded. And that self funding was really helpful for them in the years to come, in terms of having control over their work. Now, the interesting thing about their projects is that Christo is in huge demand, has been in huge demand for many years. And here's the reason. Number one, they become events like a festival or a concert. In the case of the gates, which was erected in 2005, it cost $20 million to produce, and it generated $250 million for the New York City's economy. These are not minor events. These are events that pay for themselves over and over again. So Christo is in great demand. And in fact, his most recent project, Floating Piers, I'm going to show you a short film of that in just a moment. One of the things that Christo does is not only does he have to negotiate, he's got to work with the Environmental Protection Agency, he's got to work with the city board. He's got to come up with his own funding, and he typically does through the sale of his drawings and artwork. So he is self-funded. When he finishes with one project, whatever he makes from that project gets funneled into the next project. So it has been able to sustain itself since the 1970s. And Christo, who's in his 80s now, is still working. His wife, again, passed away, but he continues to work. So let's take a look at Floating Piers. This is one of his most recent projects.
Budget's an enormous staff? That's realistic. Or just step into a store. Oh, no, there's a better way. You've skimmed catalogs, you've browsed through blogs. You know what you like when you see it. Artful contemporary, Scandinavian minimalism, organic modern. You know what you want. Overstock's where you find it. Now let's get to work. A sofa, a floor lamp, an area rug. Never forget the area rug. Everything you need with free shipping every day. Easy, right? Getting it done with Overstock, where quality costs less.
Lake Iseo is about 60 miles east of Milan. And in that lake, there's a small island home to about 2,000 people. It's a population that's totally dependent on boats and ferries. And Christo, who's wrapped the Reichstag building in Berlin, who's outlined whole islands with bright pink cloth, got an idea.
The project is now another 7 months to go. They will walk on the water.
A walk across the water.
Yeah, they literally walk on the water.
On a path of yellow fabric on top of 200,000 plastic cubes. This is the first project Christo will do without his wife, Jean-Claude. She passed away in 2009. And like their past projects, the floating piers will be in place for a limited time.
This project will never be repeated.
Christo and his team will disassemble it after about 2 weeks.
When the project is happening, in this very precious time, for a few days, the people know that they're at the site of something, because every human is unique in the world, and they like to witness something unique.
What's also unique is how these multi-million-dollar projects are financed. Early on, Christo and Jean-Claude decided they needed to do things differently, out of necessity. He says collectors and dealers are notoriously slow payers.
We cannot say to our workers on Friday, we cannot pay them because Mr. Smith, who bought, is not paying yet.
In 1982, Christo and Jean-Claude formed CVJ Corporation, headquartered in Delaware. It sells Christo's original works of art from the 1950s to the present. Drawings, collages, fabric, and there's a subsidiary for each project. Right now, Christo is working on 3 of them, including the floating piers.
Cutting or sewing the fabric was very complex.
Christo also buys back his artwork if he sees it on the market and thinks it's undervalued.
We are now the biggest owners of works of art we have.
These projects often take years. It took 24 years for Christo and Jean-Claude to get permission from New York City to do the gates, from then Mayor Michael Bloomberg.
Has it gotten easier as you've become better known, as your projects have become better known, to get past the regulatory hurdles? Are people more willing to have your artwork?
No. I don't believe it how difficult it is. Never. No, I'm not masochist. I would love to have an easy way.
Christo keeps busy. When we spoke, he was days away from a trip to Abu Dhabi to work on another of the 3 projects he's juggling right now. Christo is 80, and as our interview ended, we asked him if he has even more projects planned.
You know, Jean-Claude was saying, we're so young and very easily excited, and if we have a new idea, we tell you right away. And if I have a new idea, probably we'll learn right away.
David Gura, Bloomberg, New York.
So you can see, if you'd like to see more of his work, you can check on some of the links. Let's see if I can get out of this now.
Ever since we've gone mobile on the Now platform, something's gotten into the office.
Okay, let's go back here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so if you go to Christo's website, you can see other of his projects. They're really spectacular projects. Like I said, they're monumental. The installation of these projects are a confluence between engineers that he has to pay and volunteers. So if you ever get an opportunity, I don't know what's in the works with him right now, but typically people sign up to volunteer to help install. So he relies heavily on that participation of people to volunteer to be part of these events. And they are like festivals. Make no mistake about it, they're really quite extraordinary events. I've never been able to, in fact, Running Fence happened right before I moved to the Bay Area to go to university. And I missed that opportunity, and I've always regretted not having that ability to go back and experience that. So let's go ahead and take a look at one public event that you may be familiar with, maybe not. This is titled Burning Man. This happens every year. And it was first organized in 1986 by Larry Harvey and friends. It was a San Francisco event, and it had a purpose to create an environment, a festival-like environment, whereby it was an event to just bring anybody who wants to participate and create, make a contribution to Burning Man, to be able to come and construct and sort of live in this creative environment for a short period of time. However, you can't sell anything. Its purpose was to decommodify artwork so that it became a creative event rather than an event to be able to market. So there are rules, and here are some of the rules and guiding principles of Burning Man. So number one, it has to be inclusive. In other words, there's not a jury that necessarily says, yes, you can, no, you can't. It's meant to be extremely inclusionary. Number two, Burning Man is devoted to gift giving. So what that means is that gifting does not contemplate a return or exchange for something of equal value. So you can come, you can participate, you can donate items, but you can't be paid for items. So there's no selling. There's no selling there. Demodification. Burning Man encourages the individual to discover, exercise, and rely on his or her inner creativity for the event. So you get people from all different backgrounds, not just artists, not just musicians, not just engineers. You get people from all backgrounds that come for the purpose of the act of creating. Radical self-expression. Radical self-expression arises from a particular version that an individual might have. communal effort, meaning that its intention is to be collaborative. It's not about an artist who has a vision and goes into their studio and paints a painting. This is about pulling together community to have a collective artistic experience. Civic responsibility. This one's a really good one. The idea that a civil society means that you are responsible for the public welfare to endure, for its members to thrive. So you have to resume the responsibility of participating, but you also have to assume the responsibility of cleaning the area too. So leaving no trace is very, very important. Everybody has to participate in cleaning up at the very end. So the idea is that there's also commitment to the environment. Burning Man is usually an event that happens in the Nevada desert. So you go in there, you create these fantastic events, and then at the end, they're all dismantled. And in the case of the icon or the symbol, which is Burning Man, which you can see here, you see him at the top. He is constructed in a completely different way every year. And at the end of the festival, he's burned, thus Burning Man. And the idea is that this is meant to be a very specific kind of event. It has nothing to do with market economy. This has to do with creative endeavor. Lastly, immediacy, immediate experience in many ways. It's the touch tone value of our culture. What Burning Man sets out to do is to remind us that we all come to the table with some kind of creative energy. What is that energy and how do we access it? How do we know that we have it? So I'm going to show you a clip of Burning Man. This was the 2017 Burning Man. So let's take a look here.
Since I can remember, the first act is to locate with the GPS the center from which the entire city is surveyed. And what that results in is that as people walk down these radial streets, the man is always hovering before them. And indeed, every turning, every dimension of the entire plan of the city derives from that infinitesimal space. Early on, many years ago, when that time came to drive that stake in the ground, everyone takes a hammer and imparts an ounce of energy in tapping that spike. And of course, the man goes over that, so his spine is coterminous with it. And it's one axis. And on that temple, it continues upward as a golden spike. So I thought to call it the temple with the golden spike. Not the temple of the man, but the temple of the golden spike. And that meant we had to put him in a house, in a home, and close him. And there was much controversy about that.
This is the first year in Burning Man's history that the man has been enclosed in a space, even a temple-like space. And in many ways, when we first published that, people were appalled. They were sort of horrified. What are you doing?
At the end, there was an argument we had. We'll leave it open so you can see the whole figure as you move toward it. But I said, no. If they see the whole figure, they'll say to themselves from a distance, they'll say, well, it's big. And they'll grow used to the fact that it's big, and when they walk in, they won't even look at it. Because they know what it is, they think. I said, we put a door in front, so they walk in. To having to elevate their gaze, actually bend the top of their spine until they feel almost as if they'll topple over, so that he feels impossibly large, vastly larger than man. And that will inspire awe.
And then you started to get these comments that, no, this is perfectly appropriate because isn't this the man's home? And by combining the figure of the man with elements of the temple, which are, thoughtful and mournful and more sober, you've sort of encapsulated the full continuum of ritual in this one structure. Radical has multiple meanings, and the one that most people are most familiar with involves, going for broke out there. But it also means, in a very basic sense, what is fundamental to. This theme has triggered a lot of responses in people, and the real key question here appears to be, how much attention does it get you to pay? Rituals, our daily rituals, do have an effect on us, do have a power on us. There are many things that if you aren't prepared to see them or notice them, you don't notice them at all.
And we wouldn't ask anyone to believe anything, but we provide them with experience, and then they'd have to work to construe that as meaning, their own meaning in their own lives. And I think we fit in. If you get people, put them in sort of existential situations, like fraud, a tornado or two doesn't hurt. And then you invite them to work and play. And if you have them do both at the same time, rituals just originate naturally. Labor takes you away from your ego, and play frees your imagination from incessant self-concern. And combine those two things that make you self-forgetful, and you inherit a lot of spirit and soul. And then what happened in instance in time, rituals just originate naturally. You're not even thinking about it consciously, just having internalized them all. You just do it. Again, it's about doing.
I had been very inspired by Burning Man art and wanted to contribute a large-scale installation of some kind. And the question was, what could we bring to the playa that might be missing? And so that's kind of where the idea for the tree came, and we were doing some research online and found the tree of Tenere, which was a tree that grew in the middle of the Sahara Desert that used to attract desert traders and travelers during their journey across the Sahara. It sort of fits perfectly with Burning Man itself. The original tree of Tenere was a desert tree. Its roots had grown 100 feet down to the nearest water table, and it was the only tree for 250 miles. That original tree was actually much smaller than this one. It was an acacia, and completely unremarkable in many ways, but because it was the only tree around, people would go out of their way to meet under this tree for shade, for community, for ritual, and for rest. We thought that putting a tree in the middle of the desert might attract, large communities of people, not just to climb, but also to interact with the tree and perform rituals. And we thought at Burning Man that would almost be a sort of identical type of experience. We never actually saw the full thing put together until we came out on the playa to build it. The tree came in 40 pieces, and we had to string 3 miles of wire for power and data before we could assemble the limbs and put them onto the tree and put all the leaves on, and that took 3 or 4 days alone. It was a really, really difficult process. So we wanted the tree to be climbable, and it's very challenging to kind of do that with real wood or with like a real tree. So we decided to make the tree from a steel substructure, which is strong enough to support 60 climbers. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of technology that goes into the tree, but ultimately we thought the idea of building a lifelike tree in the middle of the desert could create sort of drawing into nature and an appreciation for nature, which is not something you normally associate with the desert. Yeah, this tree, if you saw it in your neighborhood or in a park, you almost wouldn't even notice it. But when it's the only tree around, it sort of becomes a magnet for people. I think we were all very happy with the result. It sort of almost felt like it took on a life of its own.
I'm an artist and been coming to Burning Man for the last 8 to 9 years. This year is special because my partner and I wanted to bring out an actual art piece to bring to the playa. So in 2015, Lake County had a wildfire that raged through the whole county and burnt over 100,000 acres of forest land, including my place. Ironically, I decided not to work that year for Man Base, and I wanted to focus on my farm and my home up in the mountains. And thank God I was there because the place burned down. No, it's a raven. It's a raven? Representing the magic of the unknown. You fall into the unknown, you never know how to come back. I love that. It's a memorial for the Lake County fires. Burned down. So the place where we've create all this is called Raven's Landing. And so we have a bunch of ravens. And so we wanted to create a home and a special space for the ravens. So the idea was to take the burnt trees and the beauty that is in the forest after a fire and present it to people.
Beauty lies in a burnt forest. The life has already been taken, and the space is to have this kind of opportunity to preserve the wood. An illustrator, and Lena is my mentor too, and her stories inspire me a lot. At Raven's Landing, we always thought about building tree houses, but we didn't want to kill the trees or harm the trees. So now kind of nature made this setting, and also it makes it more real that they've been already burned.
All these trees have been hand chosen by Ava and I to become part of this project. They were previously burnt in the fires. This here is really special wood. This is manzanita wood. It's different than the oak, but this also burnt up in the fires. When we took them out of the forest, it's very different. We had to debark them so that there was no moop, and then we recharred them back up to look burnt and then shellac them. When you're working with natural and you want to keep it natural, you let it be what it wants to be instead of manipulating it to what you want it to be. So I left these ones black, but what's interesting about the manzanita is as I sanded down more and more the layers, it got more and more beautiful, and you could see these stripes and these movements and the colors coming out. The more we take off our layers, the more beauty we have inside. Hopefully people realize when they see and understand the story of fire and losing everything, but being able to look past all that and create something. 2 years ago, I had nothing. I didn't even know who I was in a way because I lost everything. With the help of Burning Man organization and the grant that we were able to create beautiful artwork to bring to the playa for thousands of people. I know there's a lot of people still holding on to the idea of their loss, and hopefully something like this will kind of give them that inspiration to let go and move on.
That's good. And you know always if it's no good, burn it. Yeah, trouble behind. And you know that notion just crossed my mind. 72 years old. Is that the question? No. My name's David Best, and I'm in Nevada at the Black Rock Desert. And I'm in a bus that I made at the World Wood Day in 2017 for Long Beach, California. It was funded by Wood Culture, and I've brought it from California to Nevada. I'm happy. I thought maybe the man base was going to try to take away from the temple, but you can't. The temple is a different thing than this, you know. And so that made me happy that both of them could survive, you know. This is a place where all hell breaks loose, and everybody should be happy and yell and scream. And that should be a place where people reflect. Everybody has rituals, you know. When you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth, that's a ritual. You know? You get home at night after work and you take off your clothes and you sit down and you have a cup of tea or a drink. That's a ritual, you know.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Oh, here we go. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude, and we'll pick up the discussion the next time we meet. So, goodbye for now.